wage inflation across New Zealand is 2.1%. Why is that an important number? Because CPI inflation, or general cost of the economy inflation, is 3%. The average worker is now having a pay rise, if they're lucky enough to get one, below inflation. In fact, the average worker is now seeing a real terms pay cut of nearly 1% for doing the same job in the same place. So the average worker is now going backwards. That laser-like focus on the cost of living gets harder and harder to achieve if the real value of your wages are actually going backwards. Kia ora koutou, and a warm welcome to episode 27 of Locked Out with Craig Renney. By day, this podcast looks at the numbers in New Zealand and asks the hard questions so that you can too. We hope that you're enjoying the show and what we do here at Locked Out. If you like the analysis that you hear in the show and think that others would too, then give us a recommendation to your friends or even your enemies. Also, give us a recommendation wherever you get your podcasts. It really helps get the word out. Here at Locked Out, we're always interested in what our viewers and listeners want to know. If it's making you ask, did we save the Crown accounts last time round by underspending by $500 million on the health system? You can be in no doubt we are too. So get in touch. I'm on X, Blue Sky, and on Substack. We want to hear how we can help you better understand what's really going on and how you can navigate the numbers being thrown around by politicians and experts alike. Now, today, I want to talk to you about unemployment and unemployment data. And the reason I want to talk to you about that is because we got the Household Labour Force Survey for New Zealand, the last set. It's a really important set because it looks at both what's happening in the labour market, but it also tells us about what's happening in wages. Now, unfortunately, the bad news first, and it's a long list of bad news. Unemployment turned out to be at a 9-year high of 5.3%. And it took a turn for the worse because on all of the key indicators, unemployment, underemployment, hours, everything else, they're all down. Now, unemployment and the labour market is what we call in the trade a lagging indicator. So when things are going badly in the economy, we don't tend to see that happen in the labour market. And then when we think things are going better, it takes a while for that to feed through to the labour market. And that's certainly what the current government is hoping. It believes that there are green shoots in the economy, and that if we look past this data, things are getting better. But certainly right now, the unemployment data is telling us that workers and working people aren't seeing the benefits of any growth, if it does exist at all. So let's start with the headline rate, 5.3% unemployment. What does that mean in the real world? Well, that's 160,000 people unemployed. 160,000 people unemployed is the most number of people unemployed since March 1994. That's a very long time ago. That's more than 30 years ago since we had this many people unemployed in the country. Now, undoubtedly, the population has gone up between there and then, but we shouldn't be having that number as an aspirational target. It should be much lower than it is right now. And also that unemployment is very unevenly distributed. For people like me, unemployment's much lower, but for Māori, for Pacifica, it's much higher. For Māori, the unemployment rate across the population is 10.5%. For Pacific people, it's 12.1%. There are a record number of people who are what we call underutilized. Now, what that means is they want more work or they want more hours, but they can't get it or they can't get access to it. There are now 406,000 people underutilized in New Zealand, and that's a record. And when we look at the number of people who want more hours, just want more hours and can't get it, about 2/3 of those people, what we call the underemployed, they're female. So again, we're seeing very different labour market consequences depending upon who you are. If you're a female worker, you tend to be working more in part-time work and you can't get the hours that you're after. If you're Māori, Pacifica, there's just high levels of unemployment overall. But the group that's really suffering at the moment are young people, those aged 15 to 24. When we look at their data, over the past 2 years, there's an extra 15,500 people unemployed. And the rate of youth unemployment is growing. The rate of what we call NEETs, not in education, employment, or training, is growing and is accelerating again. These are people who it's really important to be in work or training. The longer you're out of work or training at a very young age, the more likely it is you will spend out of work in the future, and the more expensive it becomes to get people into work. You have to intervene much harder to do so. So interventions at that very early age pay huge rewards for the rest of their lives. But again, nothing we're seeing from this government is telling us that they understand that problem. When we see wages overall, now wages across the country measured by the labour cost index, which measures a thing called wage inflation. Wage inflation across New Zealand is 2.1%. Why is that an important number? Because CPI inflation, or general cost of the economy inflation, is 3%. The average worker is now having a pay rise, if they're lucky enough to get one, below inflation. In fact, the average worker is now seeing a real terms pay cut of nearly 1% for doing the same job in the same place. So the average worker is now going backwards. That laser-like focus on the cost of living gets harder and harder to achieve if the real value of your wages are actually going backwards. And again, it's very unevenly distributed. 44% of workers at this survey saw their wages go nowhere. They saw no pay rise at all. And that's the highest number we've seen in that for about 5 years. 68% of workers overall saw a pay rise less than inflation. So more than 2/3 of workers saw a pay rise less than inflation. More than 2/3 of workers are seeing their pay going backwards in real terms. And importantly, both public and private wages are now going backwards in real terms. Previously, the government had been claiming that public sector workers were still seeing real terms pay increases. Public sector pay increases across the board rose at 2.4%. The suffering across the workforce, at least in that sense, is more equally distributed. So there are real challenges here in the labour market. We're not seeing wage growth, we're not seeing employment growth, and where we are seeing growth, it's in more part-time work. We saw the number of full-time jobs has fallen by 39,000 over the past 2 years. Now, that's an enormous loss in New Zealand, but the number of part-time jobs grew a little bit over that period. We're seeing people transfer from full-time work into part-time work. And why is that important? Because the unemployment rate would be higher if those full-time workers weren't shifting down into part-time roles. And then shifting down into part-time roles, those part-time roles that were previously available to people who were just starting out at work, people who needed a bit more hours, they're not able to access that, which is why there are then so many people who want more work and can't get it, because everyone's trading down. And in trading down, it means people have less in their pockets. It means they're likely to spend less, which means if they're spending less, they're consuming less, which is what we're seeing in the consumer confidence data. The consumer confidence data in New Zealand is currently very low and is falling. That consumer confidence then translates into a lack of expenditure in shops and retail and accommodation and everywhere else, which then again feeds that lack of economic growth. And that lack of economic growth, again, feeds the lack of employment growth and we see it becoming circular. There's no engine of growth in New Zealand when workers aren't able to get ahead or are able to see a future in which they're going to get pay rises that lift their wages. Now, again, 5.3% unemployment, 160,000 workers out of work, more than 400,000 workers who want more work or access to work and can't get it. Okay, but is New Zealand unusual in this space? Well, it is a bit. New Zealand has always been a place where our unemployment record in comparison to other countries has done pretty well. New Zealand now is joint 18th in the OECD for its unemployment rate. We're actually well above the OECD average, which is 4.9%. But those countries we often compare ourselves to more. The UK has an unemployment rate of 4.7% on the same basis. Australia, 4.3%. The US has an unemployment rate of 4.2%. There are approximately 2.5 million fewer hours being worked than 2 years ago. If you put that into context, that's about, if you were to work 2.5 million hours, that's about 1,200 years of work. And that's being worked less in this country. Despite the population growing over the past 2 years, the labour force growing over the past 2 years, and our economy growing over the past 2 years. So when someone tells you that there are green shoots, when someone tells you that things are going well, across the country, unemployment is growing. If you happen to live in Auckland, the Waikato, in Northland, the top of the North Island, unemployment is now much higher than the national average. Unemployment in Auckland is above 6%, as it is in Northland. In Wellington, the number where I'm sat here today, the number of people who are out of work has increased by 50%, from 9,500 to above 14,000 in just the past 2 years. Now, clearly the government cuts program and cutting public sector workers won't have helped that, but the knock-on effects on confidence, the knock-on effects on investment are the things that are driving the poor outcomes in this economy. As with everywhere else in the world, whenever we try austerity, whenever we try and cut our expenditure in this way, it always affects the economy, and austerity and these cuts tend to deliver these results. So what should we be doing and what is being done? Well, right now, the government isn't doing anything. We don't see a program of response to encourage new jobs being created. We're not protecting existing jobs. Now, I was in Tokoroa last week talking to the workers affected there, and they've not only lost OG, they've lost Carter Holt Harvey. And we're seeing there's something that's being repeated in towns up and down the country. When we look at what's happening in terms of government response in benefits, are we using the benefit system to help encourage people into training or retraining? No. We increased tuition fees by 6% this year, on top of increasing tuition fees by 6% last year. The government halved the support for apprentices at a time when we're desperate for apprentices, desperate for support for new tradies. We've lost jobs in construction. We're about 21,000 fewer people working in construction than 2 years ago. We lost jobs in lots of other sectors, but particularly in professional, technical, scientific, and other associated roles. Again, we're tearing out the heart of the productive, the manufacturing, the other industries that should be leading the charge on growth in New Zealand. We're also seeing a return to a much harder line on things like benefits. We're taking away, for reasons I cannot fathom, job seeker support from 18, 19-year-olds at a time when there are thousands of fewer of those in work and there are no jobs for those people. We're also seeing job adverts, for example, for what we call highly skilled and skilled workforces fall over the past 2 years. This might help explain why we saw more than 73,000 New Zealand passport holders leave the country permanently, one every 7 minutes and 11 seconds. Again, we have a labour market that's telling us that the economy is not well. We have a labour market that's telling us people aren't getting ahead. The economy isn't back on track, nor are people able to keep up with the cost of living because their wages aren't rising at the same rate as the cost of living. We need to do something different. We need to see a circuit breaker. We need to see a new engine of growth. Instead, we're crossing our fingers. We're hoping that the Reserve Bank's cuts to interest rates mean that people have a bit less mortgage to pay and that they feel a bit wealthier, and that if we wait until the end of 2026, when there'll be another election, people will feel sufficiently wealthy again so they won't change the government. And we will have caused an awful lot of pain in the hope, as the government sees it, that people have short memories later in the year. We need to see a different approach. And that different approach means a much more active labour market, a much more active role for government in helping people to retrain, to reskill, to get new jobs, to create new jobs in particular communities. Because if you've got the most unemployed people that you have for the past 30 years, that should really be a wake-up call for the government. It should really be a wake-up call for people who are telling you that there are green shoots in the economy. If there are green shoots, then workers and working people aren't seeing the benefits. And if there are green shoots, it's going to be a very long time on this data before working people, before your average worker starts to see pay rises rising above inflation and them starting to see some benefits or some proceeds from any growth that occurs. So the unemployment market is terrible. But in news that's not terrible, we've started to see banks' profits start to come in. And banking sector profits are still as enormous as they were last year. And the Reserve Bank last week produced a document called the Financial Stability Review, which looks at how robust, how well performing our financial sector is. And bank profits continue unapace. And over the next week, we'll get all of the big banks' profits that come in. Now, it's my guess that we'll have bank profits probably in excess for the year of around $8 billion. Now, that money is heading straight overseas to Australia. We have one of the most uncompetitive banking sectors in the world. In fact, from memory, the return on investment for banks in New Zealand is second only to Canada in the developed world in terms of the return that the investors in banks get back in profit. So we have a twin track economy. Banks are doing well. Financial institutions are doing well. But workers and working people are not. We're not back on track. And that needs to change. And we need a better plan for growth in the economy. And we need a better plan to deliver for the future. So thank you so much for joining us here on Locked Out. We hope that you found it in parts maddening and in parts enlightening. As we get closer to the election, unfortunately, the data right now is more maddening than enlightening. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review or a recommendation on YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you download. Locked Out looks forward to talking more with you next week. Don't work too hard. Goodbye.